Hello and welcome back to another session on methodology of literature. Now today we shall have a discussion on the history of British literature or the history of English literature. Before we move on to various kinds of English, that is, we have Indian English literature, we have Australian English literature, Canadian English literature, African English literature, American English literature. But before we move on to all that, we should have an understanding of the history of English literature as such. Now, in order to know the historical or in order to know the history of English literature, we have to understand the history of England or history of Britain as such. So today we shall have a discussion on the historical background of Britain before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, that is England before English. So let's begin. So the history of English literature is not very old. If you compare it to the Indian literature or the Chinese literature or even the Greco-Roman literature, the history of English literature is not very old. So it is relatively new, hardly 1500 years or so. Now, if we are to describe English literature or English metaphorically, English literature metaphorically, I would like to quote Compton Rickett. According to Compton Rickett, English literature can be seen as a splendid fabric, a coat of many colors. It has the primastic fancy of the Celt, the somber passion of the Teuton, the gold gaiety of France, Scandinavian greys, Italian purples. It is not a thing of patchwork quality, but a harmonious blend in which one element, again I repeat, one element predominates, and that element is the Anglo-Saxon. But before moving on to the Anglo-Saxons, who were actually foreigners, they were not the real inhabitants of Britain. Before moving on to the Anglo-Saxons, let us have a quick look at who inhabited this British islands, the so-called England. So here I would like to quote, I would like to quote my professor, Dr. Lal of Kerala University. I happened to watch a video which he created for his students, and that was on Old English. So basically I've taken some of the references from his lecture, and he gave the title England Before English, and I found that title very interesting. See, before we come to Old English or even English at all, we need to look at the people in England before the English people actually came. The earliest inhabitants of this island we'll have to go back a little, okay? We are going back very much to the prehistoric time. So before we move on to, or before we come to the Anglo-Saxons, let us move to that prehistoric time where the primitive men, the Paleolithic men, may have, we do not have much evidence of or definite idea about them. We do know that these Paleolithic men, they lived somewhere near the river Thames, because of the the weapons or the remains of the weapons that were recovered later from River Thames can be considered as a great evidence that these men perhaps lived near or in or near the banks of River Thames. And now it is safely preserved in the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh. So, moving from the Paleolithic, we don't know much about them, so we are not going to go into details, but moving from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age, the people who inhabited this area after the Paleolithic men, that is the primitive men, the Neolithic men, they were dwarfish, they were small, they had curly hair, and they were narrow-headed, and these people were the ones who lived in this British Islands. But again, as we said about the Paleolithic men, even about the Neolithic men, we do not have much evidence. But one thing is for sure, that we do know what happened there or who came there 1,000 years before. That is before the before the death of Christ, before AD. And these group of people were called the Celts. Okay, and they they called themselves Britons, and they lived in the major parts of British Islands. They were the Celtic tribes, and they inhabited major parts of British Islands like Albion, Hibernia and Gaul. Gaul is present-day France. These men, that is the Celtic people, what did they do to these Neolithic men? They drove them to west and north of British Islands. They, however, instead, normally what happens is when there is a war, these people who are the winners, they destroy the ones who live there, or they subjugate them. So instead of destroying them completely, that is the Neolithic people, they intermingled with them. So thus we have the Celts and the Gaels living together. Now the Britons, the Gaels and the Neolithic men, Gaels are also another tribe of people who had come there. They all intermingled and they lived together in harmony. Okay, and thus this Celts, they were the warring types, they were warriors. Now, why are they called Celtic Britons? They call themselves Celtic Britons. Why do you think they call themselves Celtic Britons? Well, there were several tribes of Celtic people: the Gaels, the Gauls, the Britons, Irish and the Galatians. They were all Celtic. The Galatians occupied northern Spain. The Gauls, that is the present day France, and the Gauls, they formed the Britons and Gauls, and today it is known as Brittany. So they spread throughout Western Europe, including the present day Britain, France, Spain, through migration. So they were all related. This Celts, they migrated, but they were all related to one another. Their legacy, however, remains prominent in Ireland and Great Britain, where traces of their culture and language still exist. That's, we have W.B. Yeats and Synge speaking about the Celtic culture, the revival of the Celtic literature. Yes, and we have also some evidence of the Celtic writing and culture that existed during that period. From what? From archaeological evidences. However, again, much is not known about the period's lifetime. Do remember one thing, that Celtic is a language related to Germanic, Italian, Greek, etc. They are also a part of the European family of languages. So the Celts, or the British Celts, they occupied the British island for a long period of time. And then one day Julius Caesar thought of conquering this island. He tried to annex these islands and make it a part of the Roman Empire. And Caesar himself landed here. Where did he land? He landed in the present day France, that is Gaul. Okay, and geographically France is very much close to Britain and is separated by the British Channel. So what did Caesar do? Caesar crossed the British Channel and he reached the British Islands, and he tried to conquer this island. But his ambition to conquer this island was futile because the Celts were very hostile and very, they were tough warriors, and Caesar had to face stiff resistance from the Celts, and he had to go back. But later, after Caesar, that means even after the death of Jesus Christ, that is after AD, that is during between the 1st and the 5th century AD, the island was later very systematically conquered by the Romans. So the Romans, they came during the between the 1st and 5th century AD, and they conquered the land very systematically. Major parts of England was conquered by them, except Caledonia. Caledonia is an old name for Scotland, and Hibernia, which is again an old name for Ireland. Except these two states, or these two parts, the Romans had systematically conquered the rest of that is the main region of British Islands. So the Celts in the present day England, that is what we have today, what we know of England as today, that major region, were ruled over by the Romans for quite a long period of time. They became the rulers of England, and they built constructions that enabled them to administer this land properly. Even today, we can see the roads made by the Romans. Another important another important aspect is the Hadrian Wall. Hadrian was a Roman emperor, and he built a wall called the Hadrian Wall to prevent the hostile Celts who inhabited the Caledonian region. Now, that is, Caledonia is a present day Scotland, where we had the inhabitants of that place were the Gaelic tribes, the Picts and the Scots. They were very hostile people. So in order to prevent, and besides, not just that, Scotland, that is Caledonia or present day Scotland, was the terrain also was very mountainous, and therefore the Romans found it very difficult to occupy these regions, or even to subjugate these people, because they were very hostile and they were great warriors. So what the Romans did was they built a wall, and the wall was called the Hadrian's Wall, and the remnants of the wall are still seen today, or are still visible today. The Romans thus concentrated only on the lower part of the island, and the Roman Brits, that is, they were called, now they ruled there for a few centuries. Gradually, because these Romans introduced Christianity, the Celts, they started to lose their warlike quality. they became more human, they became civilized, and they they were reduced to the status of subjects, and they became very tamed people who worked for the Romans. And do remember that we still do not have any English people living here in this island. So the original English people were yet to come. They lived in the mainland Europe. They haven't come to the British island yet. And these people were the real English people that we call today as English, or after their coming only we have the word England itself. So who were these people? They were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Okay, these people, they were a large tribe or family called they belonged to the Germanic family. Many later languages evolved from this, like you have German, of course, English, and I did mention to you that these Celts, that is the people, these tribes, they spread across Europe, and they migrated, some to Spain, some to France, some to Italy, some to Germany, etc. So these tribes, that is the Celtic tribes and the Germanic tribes, they were related. Okay, they were originally one group of people, that is to say later, say 2000 years before. Then they migrated, and at the time we speak of them, that is the 5th century AD, they had very little similarity in terms of their language, because they migrated and it's been years. So slowly their dialects changed, and this change of dialects further led to a new formation of language. Now this can be taken as an example for the way language has diverged. People, communities diverged, they got separated, they moved to further lands, and they formed groups, and when they formed groups, these dialects changed over the period of time. This change of dialects led to the formation of different languages. So the Celtic language and the Germanic language now that we speak of, it is the 5th century when they came and they invaded British Islands, was totally different. Though they have emerged from the same family 2000 years ago, they now, that is the time we speak of them, that is the 5th century AD, were totally different. So the Germanic language, or the Germanic tribe, they spoke a different language, and the Celts, they spoke a different language. Now, so we come to the main people, the real English people. That is why I told you of the title that Dr. Lal had given, England before English. So before the English came, before we had the term England, before this land was termed England, or even before English originated, the place was inhabited by the Celts. Okay, the Angles. So we speak of the Angles, and there begins the Old English period. The Anglo-Saxon period is referred to as the Old English period. The Angles, the Saxons and Jutes, that is the Germanic tribes, they were similar. That is, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, they were related. They were similar, and therefore they spoke one language but different varieties of language, or varieties of one language, different dialects, that is. Like for instance, we have our Thrissur Malayalam, Trivandrum Malayalam, Kottayam Malayalam, yeah, but Malayalam is spoken differently in different variation in different parts of the state. So likewise, these people also, they spoke different varieties of one language, which was West Germanic, and probably they understood each other. though their language was a bit different from one another, they were able to understand who the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. Now here we have a situation. Okay, the Romans, they felt tired after subjugating these Celts who were warriors, after Christianizing or turning them to Christians. They got bored, they got fed up perhaps. Anyway, they left England, and the Celts were left to manage on their own. But these Celts were now, since they lost all their warlike qualities, they didn't know how to fight. They didn't know how to resist an attack. So they were vulnerable to the attacks from foreigners. And the Roman civilization, as we discussed earlier, made them a group of civilized, tamed people. So what happened was, we spoke of Caledonia earlier, Caledonia, Scotland, which even the Romans feared to, or say did not feel right to capture or conquer because of these hostile people, the Picts and the Scots. These people started attacking the Celts. Now they were all related, but again they were different tribes. Okay, group or families of different tribes or different families. So they started attacking whom? The Celts in the main British Islands. So these people, they wanted somebody to help them. The Romans had left. Now they had nobody to take or fight for them. So these Celts, they invited the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes to fight the Picts and the Scots. But what happened is, soon these invited people, they came, they fought the Scots and the Picts, they scattered them away, but they found this land very beautiful, and these invited people became residents of the place. They began a systematic occupation of England. That is how the English people came to England. The word English itself comes from Angles. Thus, the land of the Angles is referred to as England, and their language is referred to as English. Okay, so that's how we have the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes coming to the British Islands, and thus we have this systematic occupation of the British Islands, and thus was born England and the beautiful language English. So now with the coming of the Saxons, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, these three groups labeled together came to be called English, and we call them the Anglo-Saxons. We also term them as the period of Old English. The Angles, they mostly settled near Northumbria, the Northumbrian regions, that is an area north of River Humber, so it was called Northumbria. The Saxons, they settled near Wessex, and the Jutes near Kent. So remember, the British Islands were originally occupied by the Celts, maybe 2000 years before the Romans came for a few centuries, and then they left. Then came the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, which were the Germanic tribes, and they occupied England and they became the rulers of England. Now, what happened to the Celts? The Celts, they were driven to the hostile terrains of Scotland, Caledonia, which were inhabited by, as I told you, the hostile Picts and Scots that we talked of earlier. Now the funniest part is, not the funniest, the irony is, these Celts. They had invited the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes to help them resist the attack of these Picts and Scots, and now the very invited group has sent them or driven them away to the land of these hostile enemies. They tried to resist, so now they have to take refuge under the Picts and the Scots. Okay, so they were scattered and they settled in Scotland, Ireland and Wales. The Celts, they were driven away by the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. The Anglo-Saxons, they drove them away, and the Celts, they had no other choice but to live and settle in Scotland, Ireland, the present day Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Even today, the people, that is the descendants of this Celtic tribe, lives in these places of Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Now the main part, that is the main region of the British Islands, that is England, developed into 7 kingdoms under the Angles, Saxons and the Jutes, and they became very powerful. From 5th century to the 11th century, they dominated the land and they flourished, and that was the beginning of England and English, the Old England or the Old English period. Okay, once settled, another important thing also happened, and that was the arrival of Christianity. Around the 5th century, that is 597, Augustine of Canterbury, now Saint Augustine of Canterbury, came from Rome, and he was sent by Pope Gregory to Christianize England. Well, it did happen during the Romans as well. They also Christianized the people living in the British Islands, but that was the Celts, not the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. The Celts were Christianized by the Romans, but then they left. But now we have Saint Augustine, or Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory to Christianize whom? Christianize the this part of England, that is, he has come to Christianize the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes who lived here. Now they were Christianized by Augustine of Canterbury, and Augustine landed near Dover. You must have heard of the Dover beach, yes, near Dover, and he moved to Canterbury and was welcomed by King Ethelbert of Kent. King Ethelbert's wife was a Christian. Her name was Bertha, and therefore the land was very friendly towards Christianity. Augustine built an abbey in Canterbury, whose ruins are still seen even today. It was later, that is in the 16th century, this abbey was destroyed by King Henry VIII. Now that we shall look into it when we get to King Henry VIII, father of Queen Elizabeth I, okay, later in the 16th century. Now behind the abbey built by Augustine, we can see the Canterbury Cathedral. And this Canterbury Cathedral is very, very important when it comes to English history and English literature in many ways. Augustine of Canterbury became the Archbishop of, or the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Even today, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the English Church. The Canterbury Cathedral, this church is still functional, and thousands of pilgrims still visit the church. So Christianity had a very important part in shaping British literature and its history. Christianity brought in monks who were educated, who introduced Latin. England already had an exposure to the Roman language, but again that was the Celts. So English people had not come to the British Islands then. That is the Angles. English people means the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. They had not come to the British Islands then. So though it was the Celts who had an exposure to the Roman language. Now since the monks, the educated monks came here, they were exposed to the Latin language. So through the church, the English people became exposed to the Roman culture, and Latin became the language of the church. So one of the great feature of Old English is the arrival of Christianity and the arrival of Latin. Another major influence on British history and British literature of the period was the attack of the Vikings. Okay, you must have heard of the Vikings, yes? They too came from the north. That is the original place from where these Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes came. They were all related. So they also came from the north, and these Vikings were called the Scandinavians. They were called Scandinavian people, and they were also Germanic, but they belonged to another tribe. And even the Scandinavian countries today would be Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Denmark. These are the Scandinavian countries. Okay, so they were called the Danes or Danish people. They also began attacking England and occupied several parts of England. So England came under the influence of the Scandinavian languages as well. It is a long history of attacks and occupations and disturbances, because these Vikings, they were very hostile and very destructive type of people. They destroyed many monuments, many manuscripts, that is what we have today, the old English, the manuscripts of the old English. What we have today are just the ones that survived their brutality. So many of the manuscripts were that were written in Old English were destroyed by or burnt by these Vikings. In 878 AD, King Alfred, you have already studied about King Alfred. King Alfred, also called Alfred the Great. He was an Anglo-Saxon king, and he defeated the Vikings at a battle called Battle of Edington, and a separate legion was formed established for the Vikings, called the Danelaw. Okay, now there were times when we had the Danes. Even during the period of the Anglo-Saxons, we had times when the Danes ruled over England. Like for instance, King Canute ruled England. He was a Dane. He was not. He did not belong to the Anglo-Saxon tribe. He was Danish, or he was a Dane, and he ruled for a while, and he was a great king. Okay, and he died in 1035. So again, these Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes were far more powerful, and it all depended on who the king was or who ruled England. So we have King Alfred, an Anglo-Saxon king, and King Canute from the Danes, and depending on whoever was more powerful, whether it was from an Anglo-Saxon family or from the Dane family, they ruled over England. Now King Edward, also referred to as King Edward the Confessor, in the 11th century died in 1066, and his relative, that is perhaps one of the biggest blow to the Anglo-Saxon tribe, because it began the decline. The Anglo-Saxons started to fade. Their rule started to fade during 1066. Now what happened was, King Harold, he was a relative of King Edward, and he became the king. He was called King Harold II. he was defeated in the Battle of Hastings. So several invasions did the British Islands witness. It was a period of several attacks from several tribes. Now people from the north, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, Vikings, they all attacked the British Islands, and they all dominated, they ruled over it. Finally, we have the Normans coming. Harold had just become the king. Before we move on to the Norman period, the French Norman conquest, or the Anglo-Normans, we can also call them as Anglo-Normans. Before the French Norman conquest, we have this Harold. Speaking of Harold, King Harold, he had just ruled for few months when the Normans attacked England. The Normans were the Gauls. We spoke of the Gauls earlier, the Celtic tribe, Gauls, the French, that is the present day France. Okay, the Gauls were one such tribe, and the Normans were led by a man named William, who is today remembered as William the Conqueror. And later he becomes the King of England and was called King William I after he defeated and killed King Harold II. He established a totally new regime in England. So that was the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule in England. They did continue to live in England. They did not go back. The Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, they didn't go back to their homeland. They continued there as subjects of the Normans. So when we talk of the Old English period, it starts from the 5th century AD and goes on till 1150. Okay, the Anglo-Saxon language, or the Old English language, fades, and French becomes a dominant language, and thus ends the Old English period, and the Middle English period starts. Okay, so that was it for the historical background of the British British history. Now let's look at or focus on the language, that is the Old English language, or rather to say, we are not going to focus completely on Old English language. We shall, in the next class only, we shall speak about the Old English poetry, the first poem, the Old English prose, King Alfred's Chronicles. All that we shall speak in the next video, not in this. But let us just see how language becomes a merge of various dialects, the English language, how it becomes how it emerged into what we call the present day English, what you and I can comprehend. You see, the Old English was it was not easy to understand. It would be like a totally different language to us. Perhaps like you have the language in Bahubali, yes, the new language that was developed for Bahubali, yes, somewhat similar to that, because it was totally different, completely different from what we understand English as today. So how did it originate, or how did this change happen? Let's just have an understanding of how language became important, we did speak about various tribes ruling England, and whoever rules introduced their language, and how that language got mixed with the other languages that was already there. So let's have an understanding of the language part of English. Okay, we spoke of the historical background of England. Now let's just have an understanding of the language part. Okay, so as we discussed earlier, in ancient times, that is before the death of Christ, that is AD, there were no natural boundaries. There were just groups, tribes of people, all warriors. There existed the system of slave keeping, fighting amongst each other, and whoever wins will occupy that territory. So there were no boundaries, okay, and the stay of these tribes, that was not permanent either, because fresh tribes will come and they would then attack the occupants, and whoever are there and whoever lose, they become the subjects and the winner would rule. So earlier we had the Celts, right, who subjugated the Neolithic men and who lived in that British Islands or near the river these Neolithic men who lived near the British Islands or the river Thames. We spoke of it earlier. They subjugated these Neolithic men and they started to rule. So the Celts were also not the real inhabitants, they also were the ones who came from far off places. So they came, they conquered and they stayed, right? Then we have the coming of the Romans. And after the Romans left, there comes the attacks of the Picts and the Scots, that is the Celts themselves, and this to counter this attack, the Celtic Britons, they invited the Anglo-Saxons, who were the northern men, and they belonged to the Germanic tribe, and they were all related. They came to help the Celts to fight the Picts and the Scots, but they found the land again island pleasing and they decided to stay. And what happened to the Celts? They drove the Celts to farther lands like Scotland and Ireland, and the Celts thus they had no other choice but to live in peace with the Picts and the Scots, who were their enemies earlier. Now that the Anglo-Saxons, they were at home in the British Islands and were happily ruling the island, they had frequent attacks from the Vikings, and again it was all about whoever loses are the subjects and whoever wins becomes the rulers. So later in 1066 AD they had to face an attack from the Normans. These Normans were also northern men and they were warriors just like the Anglo-Saxons, and they were also related and they formed the Anglo-Normans. So the Norman, if you look at the Normans, what is Norman? Norman was a dialect or is a dialect in French, and thus begins the period of Middle English. So all that we discussed, right? Now let me tell you something very strange yet very important. The relation between knowledge and power has been very intimate. As Michel Foucault, he says, one of the he's a very famous Marxist critic. He wrote on the subject. So Michel Foucault, he wrote on the subject on the topic, relationship between power and knowledge. Now he calls this relation very intimate. After all, it is power that determines the kind of knowledge that we have, particularly language. So we can look at our own history. If you look at the history of India, in the ancient times, Sanskrit was the language of the people here, because the Sanskrit speaking people were in power. So whoever is in power posts their own language and everybody starts speaking, using, writing that language. After that we have the Muslim period. and we have the Persian language flowing to our country. So later Sanskrit was slowly replaced by the Persian language, and out of interaction between the Persian and the Sanskrit language came out Hindi and Urdu and many other languages. Same is the case with English. The island of England in ancient times, as we discussed, were ruled by the Celts, right? And so they established the Celtic language and the Gaelic languages. So when they governed England, the Celtic and Gaelic language was the language of power. Then comes it was mostly spoken language. It was not mainly written, it was mostly spoken language. And then comes the Latin, and who brought in, then comes the Romans who brought in Latin, or who brings Latin, and thus, because the Christian language was born in Italy, and thus Latin became powerful medium for all the Normans. Okay, the Bible was in Latin, and it became very influential for all the Europe, and very quickly Europe turned to or turned Christian, and all the clergy thus who came thus were educated, and they knew Latin. Even the alphabets, if you look at the alphabets of English we use today, that comes from Latin. So that is why we call them the Roman alphabets. English did not have alphabets of its own. It is the alphabets that we have today, the A, B, C. Yes, these alphabets were adopted by the English, not just the English, the whole of Europe adopted this language from the Romans. So ultimately every language, if you look at it, leaves an impact on the speech of the people, on their lives, on their culture, on literature, and all these things gets accumulated. So that is enough for today, because if we move on, the next few things that I want to tell you is a merge of various languages. All these languages gets accumulated, and it will have, that's what we said in the beginning, Compton Ricketts quotes, where English is a merge of various languages. You have the Celtic language, you have the Scandinavian language, you have Latin, you have English. Yes, all these merge to form what is English today. But we haven't reached the formation of English. We have only reached up to the Old English period. We'll understand it further in the next few classes. So thank you for your patient listening, and I'll see you in the discussion class. Thank you, and stay safe.